Hello, welcome to Unorthodox Jewish Beliefs, Part 2. We had a little difficulty this morning with Zoom, but we're going to do this now and record it and put it up for your viewing and comments. So, oddly enough, today's talk is about God, what we can believe about God, and we're hoping that God will be with us so that we can finish this recording. So, what I want to talk about today, actually, I'm going to share with you, go back and forth sharing you my documents here as we talk about them. So, the first one is sort of the outline for the talk today. All of these, by the way, are available in the handout section on our website, so you can download them and look at them at your leisure. So, the first thing I want to say about this is the reason I called this class Unorthodox Jewish Beliefs. And although I called it Unorthodox Jewish Beliefs, that may be a bit of a misnomer, because what I'm now going to argue is that there is not necessarily really an Orthodox Judaism. Of course, there is Orthodoxy as opposed to conservative and reform, but Judaism has for centuries, even millennia, entertained the idea that there are many different possible beliefs, particularly about God and about revelation, that are considered legitimate within the Jewish world. And the concept of orthodoxy is the idea that there's only one correct Jewish or any view or belief about a subject. Just like orthopedics is the correcting your foot, right? And orthodontics is correcting your teeth. Orthodoxy, right, is correcting your beliefs. Dox as in doxology, a statement of belief. And so the idea that there's only one correct Jewish belief that is absolutely certain is not really a Jewish concept. It's true, and don't get me wrong, there are certain beliefs that are definitely not Jewish. So there are boundaries to what's considered acceptable. But within those boundaries, there's a lot of argumentation that's always existed in the Jewish world, and that's what I want to start with today to talk about that idea. So let's take a look at the sources. The first point is that, and some of these are biblical sources and some are rabbinic sources. The first one comes from Psalm 62, verse 12, which says, "One thing God has spoken, two things have I heard." And regardless of whatever that verse meant in its own context, in rabbinic learning, that verse is understood to mean that God can say two different things using the same words. In other words, you can interpret a verse of the Bible in more than one way, and they're both legitimate. It's legitimate to interpret the Bible in different ways. And they use this verse from Psalms as one of their proof texts. Rabbi Ishmael's school is one of the classic schools of rabbinic teaching in the Mishnaic times, said, "Behold, my word is like fire, declares the Lord, a hammer that shatters the rock." And Rabbi Ishmael interpreted that verse from the book of Jeremiah to mean, just as a rock is split into many splinters, if you smashed it with a hammer, it shatters into a million pieces, so also may one biblical verse convey many teachings. And this is a quotation from the Talmud. That TB means Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, from the tractate Sanhedrin, page 34a. So Rabbi Ishmael says, one verse of the Bible can be shattered into many different interpretations. And then there is the concept that I headlined this section, the Torah has 70 faces. The earliest source for the term Shivim Panim LeTorah, literally the Torah has 70 faces, comes from a late rabbinic work called Numbers Rabbah. It's a collection of midrash on the book of Numbers, and it is divided into chapters and sections also. So chapter 13 of Numbers Rabbah, verses 5-16. You won't find it in the book of Numbers at chapter 13, so don't look for it there. If you go to Sepharia, which is the Jewish works on the website, you will find at least the Hebrew version of Numbers Rabbah, and there you can find this in the Hebrew. Anyway, it says there in Numbers Rabbah, dated to about the 12th century, the term is also used by a rationalist, Abraham ibn Ezra, Sephardic Jew, who died in 1167, and he introduced it into his Torah commentary, right? So when he's commenting on the Torah, he says, look, there are many different ways to interpret the verses. I'm giving you one of them, because the Torah has 70 different ways to be interpreted. A century later, Nachmanides, a mystic commentator who died about 100 years later, also said in his commentary that the Torah has 70 faces, and I'm giving you a few of them. He usually gave you several different interpretations. It is also appears several times in the Zohar, which many of you know is a mystical text. This concept was used by rationalist and mystical Torah exegetes, indicates how fundamental it is to understanding the meaning of divine revelation. The number 70 is used in rabbinic literature to indicate a large number. It's not, don't take it literally. It doesn't mean there's literally 70 interpretations, just a big number. It can be interpreted many ways. Just like the rabbis used to say there are 70 nations or 70 languages, so this idea reflects there's many different ways to interpret a biblical verse. This is a quotation from an article from Jewish Bible Quarterly, which you can access from the blue website. The red one no longer works, so I had to find a new one for you to look it up if you want the original. And finally, one of my favorite midrashim comes from the story of the giving of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. So we're coming up to the holiday of Shavuot, where we're going to read the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments opens up with Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods besides me. But when it says, I am the Lord your God, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, in Hebrew, the your is singular. You can't tell that in English, because in English, your plural, your singular is the same, unless you live in Texas, in which case we say plural y'alls, right? So God didn't say, I am y'all's God. He was saying, I'm your God in the singular. And so that's kind of peculiar, the rabbi said, because God is talking to everybody standing at Mount Sinai. According to the Torah, 600,000 men over the age of 20, maybe some 2 million people altogether, and yet give is that Rabbi Levi gives is that the Holy One appeared to Israel at Sinai as though he were a statue with faces on every side. 1,000 people might be looking at the statue, but it would appear to each to be looking directly at him. So too, when the Holy One spoke, each and every person in Israel could say, the divine word is addressing me, right? So I like to say that this is kind of like Disneyland or Disney World. If you go to the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland or Disney World, one of the first things that happens after you get off the elevator is you pass by these 4 busts, right, that are sitting on a shelf. And as you walk right past them, their eyes follow you all the way across, like they're watching you go, moving directly across, like they're looking at you all the time. Which is very clever technology that was designed by the Walt Disney people, decades ago, before modern technology. But back in Rabbi Levi's day, 1,500 years ago or more, he had that idea also, that God would look like a statue, but its face would be looking directly at each person standing there. It's kind of shocking that Rabbi Levi would choose to do that. I mean, after all, the second commandment is, don't make graven images, don't make idols, don't make statues. So why does Rabbi Levi use this idea? He says to people, God was like a statue, looking at everybody individually. So it's actually Rabbi Telushkin who quotes this in his book, Jewish Wisdom, who says maybe Rabbi Levi was just trying to get everybody's attention. Like, what do you mean God was a statue? We're not supposed to make statues. God doesn't have a statue. It's not a face. But he wanted to get your attention to make the statement that he spoke to each person individually. And not only that, according to Rabbi Levi, but as we're going to see, the divine word spoke to each and every person according to his particular capacity. Some people are science-minded. Some people are artistic-minded. Some people are poetically minded, right? Every person heard the message from God in a way they particularly, uniquely could understand. It's quite a profound statement. So here are the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments. And Rabbi Levi says, not so fast. They're not those specific words that what people heard. Everybody heard something a little bit different, according to what they could understand, and felt that God was speaking directly to them in a way that they personally could understand. I didn't make this up. It's not a Reform rabbi. This is Rabbi Levi from, 1800 years ago. So as I said, orthodoxy means right, or ortho means right, true, or straight, and doxy means belief, and so therefore you're supposed to have one true belief, but Judaism already from its beginning seems to reject that idea. The Jewish tradition has a powerful and widespread assumption that there are many ways to understand Torah, and by extension God, and therefore Jewish beliefs about the nature of our world, humanity, and our relationship with God. In essence, Jewish traditional sources reject a narrowly defined concept of orthodoxy. In studying Jewish theology, therefore, it's crucial to remember that although there are parameters for accepted Jewish beliefs, there are nevertheless a wide range of accepted and often contradictory beliefs. And by the way, many modern Orthodox Jews would totally agree with everything I just said. And maybe even some ultra-Orthodox Jews would agree as well. After all, I did cite some pretty traditional sources there. Okay, so that's the first idea, is that there's many ways to look at things. I'm going to give you one way, actually several different ways. I'll give you my preferences. But really, this is a class for you to figure out what you want to believe, given sort of the range of possible Jewish beliefs there are on a subject. So the second topic I want to talk about is the necessity of metaphors and parables, and then the danger of using them. So the common Jewish view, 99% of the Jewish world, certainly today, would say God doesn't have a body or a physical form. And we base that on various biblical verses. God doesn't have a shape. That's why we're not supposed to make graven images, because there is no shape that can capture God's physical form. There isn't a physical form. If God doesn't have a physical form, though, how can we even attempt to describe God in language? Language was developed by human beings to describe things that exist in the real physical world. We sometimes say seeing is believing. But if God has no physical form, God cannot be seen, or touched, or tasted, or smelled, right? Or even heard. None of the senses that we normally apply to things in the world would apply to God, who doesn't exist in the three-dimensional physical world. Therefore, we need to analogize using metaphors, using symbolic speech to try and describe what we think we've perceived about God. And that also is one reason many people have a hard time believing in God, because seeing is believing, but we can't see God. So how can you believe in something you can't see? Just a short answer to that question. There are many things we can't see and we do believe in, one of them being love, right? Hopefully everyone listening to this believes in love, and they love someone in particular, or many people in particular, and they are loved by other people. But love is not something you can really see, and yet we believe it's real. So not everything has to be seen to be believed, but it does make it a little more difficult to describe and to explain. One way for a modern person to understand God's existence is to think of God as a being that exists outside of the space-time continuum. This is an advantage of living in a post-Star Trek world and post-Einstein world, right? So Einstein said that space and time are related. And if God doesn't exist in space, in three-dimensional space, that means God also exists outside of time. And that helps us to understand a very classic Jewish idea that God can be everywhere, all the time, forever. How does God manage to do that? Well, it's because God exists outside of the bounds of space and time. And now we have sort of the physics structure of that to understand better what our ancestors already just tried to describe many centuries ago. Again, one of the reasons I believe in God is that our ancestors were able to think in these terms centuries before Einstein gave us the physics to explain them, right? God exists outside of the space-time continuum. But if the five senses we have can only perceive things in the physical world, is there some other sense that we can use to try and perceive a being that does not exist in the physical world? And here is my particular belief about that, is that yes, there is a sixth sense that God has given humanity, right? So we talk about the five senses, and those are the senses that we use to perceive the physical things that exist in the physical universe. But we have a sixth sense, a spiritual sense, that God has also given human beings that help us to understand things that don't exist in the physical realm. This is just my personal belief. And I would say that's the reason why human beings all over the planet are searching for something beyond what we can taste, touch, smell, see, and hear, right? That we think that there's more to the universe than what actually exists in the physical realm. People have developed religions all over the world, believing that there's more to the universe than what we see, believing that there's a cause, a purpose, a meaning in the universe. What gave them that idea? Well, I believe that we all have this spiritual sensor receptor that God has given us that allows us to perceive those things. So that's my personal belief. You can accept it or not accept it. In any case, even if we were able to perceive such a being using the sixth sense, let's say, how do we then describe that perception to others using language, which is generally used to describe things? Yeah, we can describe abstract ideas, but describing those abstract ideas is often also difficult, and because most of the language we have is designed for things that we can see, smell, taste, doesn't hear. Now I want to tell you a story, and I've attached the story to this handout, but I'm not going to read it, but I'll just tell you the story. It comes from India, from the Indian subcontinent, about the blind men and the elephant. So this is the story. A dozen, let's say, blind people encounter. It's told different ways, and you can read the article if you want to. Let's say a dozen people come in contact with an elephant, but they're blind. And they all come in contact with a different part of the elephant. So one has the tusk, and one has the trunk, and one has the floppy ears, one has the hide, one has his big toe, one has his tail. And they all try to describe the elephant based on the part of the elephant that they've come in contact with. And then they argue about what an elephant is. This is an elephant. No, this is an elephant. No, this is an elephant. And they can't agree on what an elephant is. And so they go to a wise man and they say, which one of us has described the elephant correctly? And the wise man says, you are all correct and you're all wrong. You are all correct in that the part of the elephant that you came in contact with, you're describing pretty well. But you only came in contact with a part of the elephant, and you thought that was the whole elephant. So you missed the big picture of what an elephant is. So if you think about all the different things that you sensed, and a bunch of things that none of you sensed, then you get a better idea of an elephant. And the idea of the story, even as it's used traditionally, but I'm going to modify it just slightly for us, is that no one human being understands everything there is to know about the nature of the universe, and certainly about the nature of God. And so each one of us comes in contact with God, let's say, in different times in our lives, in different places, maybe at the Grand Canyon when you have an awesome experience at the Grand Canyon seeing God's awesome creation. We had a big thunderstorm here the other day when you hear the powerful thunder thundering around you, or the lightning cracks, or seeing a starry night, which some of us are now able to see now that there's less pollution. Particularly if you go outside of the city, you can see what we used to see every night, the Milky Way and all the stars in the galaxy. And you're just in awe, right? So you get this awesome sense of being in God's presence. Or perhaps you're in a hospital when you're sick, and suddenly you have this feeling of confidence and hope that comes over you, and something inspiring you that you are going to make it through this process. Where does that come from? That, I believe, is God's presence in your life. Or you're in another hospital room where a baby is being born, or you experience love and you realize that love is a gift from God. Whatever it is that you experience in life and suddenly realize that God has given you this gift, that you're in God's presence, that God is somehow in the story, you've come in contact with God, and they're very different experiences. Perhaps you're fearful, perhaps you're afraid and you want comfort. All these different experiences at different times in our lives are different, like we're all blind people trying to grab a different part of that elephant and then trying to describe that experience to somebody who might have had something similar or maybe didn't. So that's kind of the process of trying to understand God, and that's what the story of the blind elephant is. If God can't be seen, we're all basically blind, and so it makes it difficult for us to describe God. Another way to consider it is if you're driving on a meandering road late at night in the fog and you don't have your GPS on, so you can hardly see out your windows, but every now and then you pass by a sign on the road that says "this way," that indicates that someone has been down this road before and is trying to give followers signposts to help guide them in a useful direction. That's what a lot of religious writing is about. People who have explored the nature of God, felt like they've come in contact with some aspect of God, and then they write down some notes to try and say, this is a useful way of thinking about God. This will help you to understand God, right? It's like meandering on a foggy road late at night. Another parable, or another way to think about it, is, and Maimonides uses this one, which we'll talk about on the last class session. How would you describe fire to fish? Of course, in the ancient world, there were four aspects of the universe, right? And there are two sets of opposites: fire and water, earth and air. And fire and water were two opposites, and fish live in the element of water, so they could not experience fire because fire could not exist normally in water. So if you were trying to explain to a fish, I don't know how you would do that, but if you were trying to explain to a fish what a fire is, the fish would not be able to understand it. It's not in their realm of possibility of understanding. So too in the physical world, it's hard for human beings to wrap our heads around things that are in a spiritual realm. It's not in a realm we normally engage in, although I do believe we have a sixth sense that helps us in some ways to navigate it. So therefore we have to use metaphors to describe the indescribable, and I urge you to read Neil Gilman's excerpt, which is also included in this handout. We don't have time, but he puts what I've just talked about in very clear, easy words, and so it's easy to read. It's just a one-page thing. It should be a short excerpt for you to read. It's well worth reading. Neil Gilman. He was one of my teachers at the Jewish Theological Seminary, a conservative rabbi who taught theology. Just a word about Neil Gilman. So the class I took was a class in building your own personal theology, right? And so we would read various different articles and books and whatever written by different people. And then the final exam was writing your own beliefs about God and revelation and so on. And believe it or not, when I was in rabbinical school at the seminary, this was an optional class. I don't know how it could be an optional class. I don't know how any rabbi goes to rabbinical school and hasn't thought out what their personal theology is, but it was an optional class. Anyway, I took it, and I'm glad I took it because it did help me to think about these things in a systematic way. So anyway, Neil Gilman taught at the seminary theology. He's written several books, and this what I've given you is an excerpt from one of his books there at the end. So I urge you to read it. It's a nice read. So we have to use parables, we have to use metaphors, but there are some problems. We might forget that they're not to be taken literally. So a metaphor about metaphors. Metaphors are like telescopes. They're designed to help us to, this is my this is my personal thing, by the way. I came up with this metaphor. Um, Telescopes are designed to help us see something more clearly than what we could do without them, right? You look at a telescope and it helps you see the moons on Jupiter or the rings around Saturn, something you can't see with the naked eye. So that's what telescopes are designed to do. But like telescopes, you need to look through them to see what they're pointing at, right? You can't see the rings of Saturn or the moons of Jupiter if you look at the telescope. You have to look through the telescope to see what it's pointing at. And the same thing is true with metaphors. If you look at the metaphor and think that the words are literally what is trying to be described, then you've completely misunderstood what the story is, right? So if you go back to Rabbi Levi's thing and he says God is a statue facing every person, and you take that literally, you will totally misunderstand what Rabbi Levi meant. God is not a statue. He was telling you something much more significant than that. So don't look at the metaphors and thinking you've understood what you're supposed to see. That also means that they're not going to be as precise or as helpful as language, using language to describe things that everyone can perceive with the five senses, right? Our ability to perceive things on our own allows us to better understand the language that is used to describe them. So for instance, a table, we can try and describe what a table is, a surface that you put stuff on and it has legs and it elevates it off the floor. However you want to describe a table, because everybody kind of has an idea what a table is, using language to describe it kind of clarifies what we mean by table. But if you've never seen a table in the world before, how do you describe a table to someone who hasn't really seen it? So with God, the process is not nearly as precise or helpful because no one has seen God. So you're trying to describe something that you haven't exactly seen to somebody else who also hasn't seen it. It makes it more difficult. Now, the fly in the ointment here is, as I mentioned before, there's about 1% of the Jewish world, maybe it used to be a larger percentage of the Jewish world, who somehow wants to think that God has a body. Since the time of Maimonides in the 12th century, almost nobody believes this anymore. But you may run into that, and they will base their belief that God has a body or a shape based on biblical verses that seem to describe God as having nostrils that flare and an outstretched arm, right? He took us out of Egypt with an outstretched arm, and they'll take that literally, etc. I would say here nearly all believing Jews today do accept that God is incorporeal, which means he has no body, and that necessitates the use of this metaphoric language, etc. And so I'm not going to spend any more time talking about that fly in the ointment. I just wanted to point out that that exists certainly in Jewish history, and maybe in a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of Jews today. But I would say most Jews would be considered heretics if they believed that God had some physical form. Okay, so now one more caveat, and then we're going to talk about God directly. And so that is, how do we interpret the Bible then? So there's two main ways of trying to understand the Bible. One is, what did the Bible mean to the person who wrote it? What was the person thinking? What was the worldview of the person who wrote the Bible? And we have a lot of modern tools to figure that out, a lot of archaeological discoveries about society at the time, other writings from other people at the time. We have a better idea of what science was at the time. And so it's much easier for us to try and, at least we can learn more about what people actually thought they were saying when they were writing at the time they wrote it. That's one way of interpreting the Bible. The other way of interpreting the Bible is saying, you know what? These words have resonance with our life today. And the reason that they resonate with our life today may have nothing to do with what they originally meant. But they've captured a way of thinking, a metaphor, a concept, an idea. They capture an idea that really works for us today. And it may have nothing to do with what the Bible writer originally meant, but it means something to us today. So those two ways are very classic Jewish ways of understanding the Bible. One is called exegesis, that is trying to figure out what the writer meant, and the other is eisegesis. Exo means coming out. So what do we learn from what the guy was trying to teach us? And eisegesis is reading into the text something that we want to interpret, finding something in the text that means something to us, not necessarily what the person who wrote it meant. In rabbinic terminology, these two methods of interpretation are called pshat, which means the simple reading of the text. What did the text mean to the person who wrote it? That's the simple meaning. And darash, what does the text demand us to think about today? That's midrash, comes from that idea. And rabbinic midrash often goes far afield from what the original intent of the words were. The rabbis intentionally would give some new and exotic interpretation to a verse to make a point about life today. And the reason they felt they were able to do that is because they felt that God was talking to them through the words on the page, right? Giving them these new ways of interpreting it that would have relevance to the world that they lived in. And there was nothing wrong with that. Okay, so we can also call the exegesis the historical, critical, modern interpretation of the Bible. And then drash is the more traditional religious interpretation, the midrash that was collected by our ancestors over the centuries. Now you might ask a question, why are we allowed to ask the question, what does it mean to us today? Why are we allowed to continue to come up with new interpretations of biblical verses? Are we allowed to reinterpret the Bible and rabbinic texts and teachings to fit with our current understanding of the world? Are there limits to the ways in which we can do this? If so, what are the limits? I would say that this is the Jewish process, that every generation of Jews has to reinterpret the Bible for it to have meaning for the world that we live in today. Our ancestors could not have understood the world we live in today, but they gave us certain principles, certain ideas, certain concepts that can always be reinterpreted to help us understand the world around us and to understand our relationship with God. And again, modern Orthodox Jews, I think many of them would agree with me about that. And certainly Reform and Conservative Jews would as well. I am not Orthodox in the usual sense of the word. I'm a conservative rabbi raised in the Reform movement. I briefly flirted with Orthodoxy after college. So all of those things color my perspective of the topic, and I just want to state that up front as we continue to discuss these things. So now let's talk about God. So I mentioned that there's many different times in different people's lives when you can think about God, when you may have come in contact with God. And here's a thought experiment you can run for yourself. When did you experience God in your life, and what were the feelings? How would you describe it in words? And now what I do want to do is look at Adon Olam, just as an example from our tradition, where you see two very different ideas of God and they're smashed together at the same time in the same prayer. So this is part of the handout. Here's Adon Olam. It's a song we sing now at the end of most of our services on Shabbat. The translation over here is on the left. Adon Olam Asher Malach, the Lord of the universe, who ruled before any form was created. When everything was made according to his will, he was called sovereign. When everything comes to an end, he alone will continue to rule in awesomeness. He was, he is, he always will be in glory. He is one. There is no other to compare to him or join him. Right? There's no duality, no triune. Right? There's only one God. He is without beginning, without end. To him is the power and the dominion. And then it says, and, he is my God, my Redeemer, the fortress in my travail in time of distress, my banner, my refuge, the portion of my cup in the time I call. In his hand I entrust my spirit when I lie down and when I awake. With my soul and my body, God is with me, I shall not fear. So obviously, this prayer is written in two parts. The first part is what we might call the philosopher's God, the God who always was, is, always will be, creator of the universe, the sovereign, the aloof, demanding, commanding, transcendent God, right? But then it completely transforms right here at the word, which I translate as but. He's my God, my Redeemer, my fortress, my portion. I entrust my spirit to him when I lie down and I wake. With my body and soul, God is with me. I will not fear, because God is right by my side, personally next to me, giving me strength and hope. That's not the philosopher God who created the world and is aloof and demanding and commanding and outside. So this is what we call the transcendent God, the one who is beyond, and this is what we call the immanent God, the one who is right next to me, right nearby. So that is an example of a prayer, and Judaism does that all the time. We take opposite concepts or very different concepts and we smash them together and we say, think about both of these ideas at the same time and hold that thought. Ponder that for a while, right? So although we sing Adon Olam and we don't often think about it, it's kind of the last thing we do before we go out and have Kiddush lunch. It's actually an interesting prayer and an interesting challenge of philosophy. God is both the transcendent, awesome, magnificent creator of the universe, but he's also right next to me. He cares about my personal life. Imagine that. Of all the billions and billions of stars, as Carl Sagan used to say, of all the billions of stars and planets out in the universe, God cares about me on this tiny little planet. And hold those two thoughts about God in your mind at the same time, right? And we do that over and over again. I gave you lots of examples. Another one that immediately comes to mind is Avinu Malkeinu, which we recite on the High Holy Days, right? Avinu means our father, or if you want to be egalitarian, our parent, right? The one who created us personally and is in our lives helping us to grow up and mature. Our parent. But then what is the next word? Malkeinu, our king, our creator, our, the transcendent, distant God. Again, the immanent God who cares about me, loves about me like a parent cares and loves me and nurtures me and wants me to be good, and the transcendent, demanding, commanding, awesome, God of the universe. Avinu Malkeinu, in two simple words, smashed together, and then at the same time that we add whatever comes next in it. So that's a very Jewish concept. Again, trying to get across different ideas about God, um, because God is hard to grasp in one simple word. So is God like a force or is God a being? So now that we have not only Star Trek, we also have Star Wars. And thanks to George Lucas, we have a new way to think about God as the Force. Right? So the Force is this force in the universe that has this power, and you can tap into that force and use it and guide it to help create make changes in this world, right? And so God could be like a force. Mordecai Kaplan, who was a Jewish philosopher and teacher at the seminary for many decades, taught that God was the power that provides for salvation, right? So God is not exactly George Lucas's force. It is the good side of the force, not the dark side. God is only the good side of the force, a power that propels the universe in a positive direction. And for Mordecai Kaplan, God did not have a personality. God was not a being. God was not sentient. So you could not exactly relate to God as another being, but you could contemplate God's power and you could try and connect with that power in a way, but not as a being. And so you can't communicate with that force. That was Mordecai Kaplan's view. It was pretty radical at the time, and it started the Reconstructionist movement. Many conservative rabbis, however, took Mordecai Kaplan's class when they were in the seminary and held views similar to his, somewhat modified. I prefer to think of God as a being. So I would say that God is a sentient force, God is the force that provides for salvation, but there is a way to connect to God and to interact with God and to get hope and emotion and some concepts and even inspiration from God. And so once you start talking in those terms, God is more of a being than simply a force. So God is like a sentient force, I would say. This is, again, my personal view, just the way I'm putting the pieces together. You're allowed to come up with your own ways of thinking about God. Hopefully some of these ideas are helpful for you in figuring out how you want to think about God. It's only a metaphor, right? Uh, Basically, if God is a being, and then he's self-aware and has the ability to choose um, and so on, to analyze, remember, right? A force has no physical body or form, etc. I sort of believe in God as a sentient force. Okay, so the last thing I want to leave you with in this class is a really wonderful excerpt from an article by Louis Jacobs. So, a word about Louis Jacobs. Louis Jacobs was a British rabbi, was trained Orthodox. Originally was in line to be the next chief rabbi of England many decades ago, but then he came out with a book of his personal beliefs, and I guess they decided that his beliefs were not in line with the orthodoxy at the time, so he was passed over to someone else. So at that point, he ended up joining our movement in England, the Masorti movement, and he wrote many books, and is a brilliant scholar and philosopher. So Louis Jacobs is well worth reading. And there's a selection which I highly, highly recommend you all read that's in the handouts from Louis Jacobs that talks about a lot of the concepts I just talked about, including how do you believe in a God who doesn't have a body and doesn't have so on, and what does it mean to believe in God, and how do you deal with metaphors and so on. He really puts all that material well together, and what I've given you is just a couple of pages of excerpts from his longer article where I think you hit the highlights. I highlighted all those parts in yellow, but then of course I cut it and pasted it so it's almost all the highlighted yellow parts from the original article. So these are the parts that I thought were the most important parts. But the time is short now and I don't want to take more time here. So please do read the article by Louis Jacobs. I think, again, that will give you some ideas to think about when you think about God. Whatever you come up with thinking about, in these parameters, I think would be fine. The main thing in the Jewish belief is that there is only one God. There's no second God, no demi-God, no devil, no alternate gods, no duality of God, just one who's creator. And I would say virtually everybody in the Jewish world today would say God has no body, shape, or form, never did, never would, never will have a body, shape, or form, which of course is one of the things that distinguishes us from Christianity, for instance. But so those are the essential things about God. God is creator. God cares about us, loves us, wants to be good. The rest of the stuff you have to kind of fill in. I'm happy to answer anybody's questions. Because we had to record this class without interactive persons, we're going to post it on Facebook and on our website, and you feel free to email me or on the Facebook post to put questions. And also, for those those of you who are hearing this in real time, today is May 17th, 2020. So this coming Tuesday evening and Wednesday at 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock, Tuesday evening, I think it's 7 to 9, I'm going to have a Shmooze Zoom. Shmooze Zoom. So hopefully Zoom will be working and you'll be able to log in, and I'm just going to have office hours, open office hours, so to speak, where you can ask me anything, but you can ask me about this program, about anything else, and we can have follow-up discussion on this or other subjects. So look forward to hearing from you. I hope you will read the articles that I attached, and look forward to next week when we'll talk about, now that we have some idea of God, how does God communicate to us? And in that process, maybe better understand who wrote the Bible and what about the miracles that are talked about in the Bible. So that's the subject of next week. So stay tuned, and hope you enjoyed the class. Please give me feedback. It's always good to hear from you. Thank you for joining us.